Welcome back. Tonight, we'll hear unsettling stories from Reddit, encounters that chill, memories that linger, and whispers you won't easily forget. Wherever you are, these stories will keep you company. Settle in and let's start. I think my roommate might be a monster, but she does pay her bills on time. I am a stubborn person, often to a fault. I hate giving up, even if it might be a lost cause. My stubbornness is a problem, I know that. It leads me into situations where I know I should change course, but comfort and a sense of determination keep me from acting. I try to be rational, and in cases where I am expected to believe the unbelievable, I have a hard time. Now I find myself in an impossible situation where I don't have a choice. I must acknowledge I am seeing what I am seeing, and I wish I wasn't, because I don't know what to do now. Sorry, I keep getting distracted. I hear the crashing and banging in the basement again. Lania must be at it again. She is always like that. I know I should say something, but what choice do I have? I can't rock the boat. I need this house and her money, so I will do what I always do and ignore those sounds coming from the basement and the implications. Maybe I will talk to her tomorrow. I think I have to because the muffled sounds sound a little too human to ignore. But let me tell you how I got to this point, and you can decide for yourself what you might do in this sort of circumstance. It was about a year ago, and I found myself in a position I had been working towards for a while. I was finally confident that I would be able to buy a home. The market is rough now, and I have a good job. With the crazy prices, though, I thought it was unattainable. Yet I had started looking all the same. I had contacted a real estate agent and had toured a few places. After a couple of months of no good options, I started to lose hope, but then I received a listing for the perfect house. My eyes lit up when I looked at the features, and I was over the moon. The price seemed reasonable if a little high, but I was worried since I did not have much to put down and my credit was not the best. I was assured it was okay, and after getting qualified for the first mortgage, I finally signed on the dotted line and got the keys. I had done it and finally bought this place, my first home. I was so happy with the house, I loved it. Yet even then, I found myself asking, could I really stay here? I wanted it to be my forever home. It is truly perfect. Yet I am terrified of the feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach, the creeping dread of pure evil. Yes, I was horrified. My interest rate was 9% on this house for a 30-year mortgage. I know, right? I was so obsessed with the idea of owning my own home that I did not realize how much my actual payments would be at that high an interest rate, and I started to panic when I saw the huge cost. I figured I could maybe get a second job or try and get some overtime to compensate. I was just happy I had my house. That's all that mattered. The house was a gorgeous Victorian, over a century old but still in good shape. I was over the moon when I saw the place. It had everything I wanted, and I knew I would find a way to make the extreme cost work somehow. I didn't have much to move in and knew I would have to buy furniture as I went, but that didn't bother me. Moving day was hard work as I moved what little I had all by myself. I took a break before the small U-Haul was fully unloaded to get a drink of water and tested the tap. I turned it on and was troubled after a long delay before anything came out. Slowly, a reddish liquid trickled and started to flow from the faucet. It had a thick viscosity and almost smelled like blood. No, it couldn't be. Must just be the pipes. I blinked and saw clear water flowing from the sink and brushed the crazy perception off. I returned back and forth several times as the afternoon drew on, carrying boxes and wishing I had called for some help moving after all. I paused, admiring the floors and trying not to scrape them up too much with the boxes. The house had its original hardwood floor from the looks of it, and I would be devastated if it was damaged. There was a sound of something crashing in the basement, and I winced at the thought of whatever had been broken down there. A lot of old antique dishware was down there from the previous owners, and though I was not likely to use it, I thought it might be valuable, and I may even be able to sell it. Had I left something close to the shelves that fell and broke them? I went downstairs to check. The basement door was hanging open, slowly swaying despite the fact I had been fairly sure I had closed it earlier. There was a foul smell emerging from the aperture as well, and I was not sure what had happened down there. I went downstairs and saw it for the first time. I gasped aloud as I looked at what was down there. There was a puddle of dark liquid, which might have been blood here as well. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw an emaciated and skeletal body on the ground in the basement. I turned my head, and it was no longer there, if it ever had been. I got closer to see what had happened, and saw broken glass and figured maybe it was some sort of jar of old preserves or something. I stepped back and screamed when I heard a hiss and saw the body of a snake slither into a nearby crevice. Oh God, there are snakes in the basement. I didn't think they could just get into houses. I hurried back upstairs to get the broom to sweep up the mess and maybe look up snake deterrents. I saw a strange-looking woman staring at me through the kitchen window. I blinked and her face was gone, and I started to doubt my senses again. After the first day and the weirdness in the basement, the normal day-to-day was good. But the good times wouldn't last. The worst news I could receive was just about to happen. I received a call informing me I was being laid off from my job. I had to scramble to find work, and I was barely able to pay my exceedingly high mortgage. I could barely afford food, and if something went wrong or needed repair, I would never be able to afford the fix. I realized I would need a roommate or something to help split the costs and make it more affordable until I could get another decent-paying job. That was the first time I met Lania. Before I could even write up a request to advertise, I got a knock at my door. It was a tall, pale-skinned young woman with black hair and very serious eyes. The pupils seemed very narrow, almost akin to a cat or snake. She gave an air of authority and threat, but also allure. She stared at me for a moment, and I started to feel uneasy before she finally spoke. "I am here for the room," she said very bluntly, almost as if it was a demand rather than a request. I hadn't even advertised it yet. How did this lady know I needed a roommate? "Well, yes, but how did you know already?" I asked, completely dumbfounded. She looked at me, and then behind me into the house, and produced an envelope with $3,000 in it. Holy smokes, lady, I was going to ask for references, but this will do. That's more than what I was going to charge for the rent. A glimmer of a smile appeared on the woman's face, and she spoke. "Think of it as a security deposit." I hate to say it, but at the time, I was ignoring the many red flags and just focusing on how a good-looking, albeit kind of intense girl wanted to pay so much up front to live with me. This plus my savings meant I had enough to pay the mortgage and then some. I was so happy I failed to see a lot of things and ask a lot of questions that should have been asked. Lania moved in shockingly fast and made herself at home. We didn't see too much of each other because she worked a graveyard shift as a nurse or something she had said. I figured it must have been since I saw her in the early morning in blood-covered scrubs and figured it might be from the or something. She was a model roommate, though, with no issues, very tidy, and always paid her portion of the bills not only on time but normally early. Weirdly, it was always in cash, never with a check or something digital. But maybe she had an old heart and preferred paper currency. The only thing I did notice was she always kept dishes and silverware in her room, and sometimes it left very little in the kitchen when I needed some. When I reminded her, she would bring it back. One time when I was loading the dishwasher, I saw a few plates covered in a reddish sticky color that almost looked like blood. She must like rare steaks, I figured. At this point, I had secured a part-time retail job, which was enough to pay a quarter of the mortgage and hardly any food. Surprisingly, Lania was happy to pay for the rest and the utilities to boot. I didn't know how or why she was willing to help so much, but I didn't want to look a gift horse in the mouth. One night I arrived home and found the door unlocked, and it seemed like Lania was home, at least her car was there. I walked inside and heard something that sounded like muffled crying and then a shrill scream. I raced to her room and barged in. I was not prepared for what I saw. I found her splayed out on her bed. She was naked, and her face was covered with red paint or maybe blood. She was entwined with what looked like a large type of snake or python, and it was writhing across her body. I was stunned by the sight. I didn't even realize how my intrusion might be perceived until she screamed again and then turned to me as I entered, and she fixed her gaze on me, and I realized I made a mistake. I didn't know what was going on, but I took a step back and looked away as I retreated, realizing my eyes had been lingering on her bare chest. My cheeks reddened, and I quickly blurted out an apologetic. "Oh God, I am sorry, Lania. I didn't know what was going on, and I thought you were in trouble." Out of the corner of my eyes, I thought I saw her teeth take on an oddly pointed quality, and her pupils shifted like they had the day I met her. Her initial surprise and anger calmed somewhat, and despite the embarrassing situation I walked into, she made no effort to cover herself and simply said, "Please leave now. I didn't need to be told twice." When I left, I realized I needed to grab the groceries I had bought and bring them inside. I went out to the garage again, and near the laundry room, I saw what looked like an outfit for a delivery driver. It was torn up pretty badly. There was also a wallet near the washing machine that did not look like it belonged to Lania. I wondered if she had had someone over. I saw nearby a name tag that read, Ted. Maybe she was dating someone named Ted. I didn't think much of it until the following week when I started to see missing person posters up around the neighborhood inquiring about any information regarding a Theodore Wilkes, who had been declared missing. I thought of Lania and the weird behavior and the name tag, Ted short for Theodore. The implication was disturbing, but there are a lot of Teds, I figured. I also tried to put out of my mind the fact that he was a delivery driver. 1 month later, and still no luck with my job search. Worse, my hours were cut for my retail job. I was getting frustrated and feeling hopeless. I was only financially stable thanks to Lania, who continued, seemingly without objections, to pay almost all the bills. She was always nice to me when we did interact. Besides the accidental walk-in, she never seemed hostile or dangerous. Yet so many other things concerned me, I didn't know if she was just eccentric or what. The snake thing was weird though, as well as finding that name tag. Something was going on that she was not telling me. I was up late into the night looking for job listings when I heard Lania in the basement again. I did not know she was back yet. She said she normally worked nights, but it was only 10:30 p.m. I figured she would be at work still. The sound was louder than normal, and I heard strange music being played at an incredibly loud volume. I wouldn't mind if it was earlier, but I was about to try and get some sleep, so I decided to check on her. Frustratingly, she rarely kept a cell phone on hand, otherwise I would just have texted her to respectfully keep it down. I realized with creeping dread I would have to go down there and ask her to quiet down. I considered trying to ignore it, but it got louder somehow, and there was a sound of shrieking or moaning from what sounded like another woman. I didn't know what was going on, but I hadn't wanted to get involved. I lay on my bed with my pillow over my head, trying to ignore the sound, until I heard an awful scream that sounded like someone was in trouble. I raced out of my room downstairs and to the basement door. I summoned my courage and knocked loudly on the door several times, shouting, "Is everything okay in there?" There was a long pause with no sound other than the blaring music. I was about to knock again when the music was shut off, and I heard shuffling and the loud crash of something heavy being dropped on the ground. The sound of the door unlocked was promptly followed by Lania stepping outside and fixing me with a placating smile and a sheepish, yet definitely feigned ignorant response. "Yes, what's up?" I was slightly annoyed by the gaslighting and tried my best not to be too combative in my response, since I still felt like I couldn't endanger our dynamic in a way that might make her move out. Lania, with respect, what was that sound just now? It sounded like someone was hurt. Are you okay? And if everything is all right, could we please keep the music down at night? I know you are on a nocturnal schedule, but I am not. I immediately looked at her reaction to see if I had overstepped, but she just kept smiling and insisted. Everything is fine. I saw a huge spider and got startled. I am working on another art project in here, and I get carried away. The music helps me channel my creativity. I will keep it to a dull roar for you in the future. I'm sorry. She seemed to wink at the last statement, and I was unsettled, but didn't want to press the subject, so I agreed and thanked her for understanding and went back to my room. It was an obvious lie, but what was I going to do about it? I hoped I would find a better job soon and start being able to save enough to cover costs myself. or maybe get a slightly less eccentric roommate who I could trust was not doing God knows what in the basement in the middle of the night. The final and most recent event occurred 2 weeks ago. I had grown desensitized to most of the bizarre behavior of Lania as she continued to pay her bills on time and keep to her own affairs. But a simple household chore led me to see something that I can never unsee and added an entirely dangerous level of uncertainty about my roommate and her real nature. I was going about my day-to-day business at home. Another day off since my hours were terrible at the store. I was barely working 20 hours a week. I had grown despondent at continuing to look for job options after so long searching with no results or positive encouragement. I decided I would busy myself with household chores. I was cleaning up a few things when I heard a loud beeping. I wondered what it could be and then realized it was the low battery signal for the carbon monoxide detector. It sounded like it was coming from the device in Lania's room. I changed the battery on mine a month earlier, but realized I never changed hers, and the battery was running low apparently. It was midday, and I thought she might be asleep. I grabbed a couple of double A batteries and set them near her door so I wouldn't have to go in and change them. After almost an hour, she did not emerge from the room, and the beeping continued. It was a very loud chirp, and regardless of replacing them or not, I wanted to at least stop the thing from making that racket. So I made the mistake of going into Lania's room for the first time since the incident. I walked in on her. I knew it was a bad idea, but I slowly approached the door and knocked several times. No response was forthcoming, so I knocked again and nervously called out. "Lania, are you here?" Still no response. I called out louder than before. "Come on, Lania, you don't hear that sound." "That's the carbon monoxide detector. It will keep doing that unless we change the battery. I have them right here. Please change them or I can if you will let me in real quick." Once again, silence was all that responded. I tried the door and to my surprise, it was unlocked. The room was very dark. The windows had been covered up with blackout curtains or something. I turned on my phone's flashlight and shined it briefly on the bed to check. It was empty. I looked up and saw in the corner of the room the blinking detector and the target of my uninvited intrusion into her room. I stepped forward and promptly tripped on something. It was a large duffel bag that was partially open. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't suppress the urge to investigate, so I shined my light on it and was confused when I saw a large assortment of name tags, wallets, engraved jewelry, and various charms or mementos, all of which bore different names. None seemed to actually say Lania. I also saw that Ted name tag again in here with the assortment of other named items. I was deeply disturbed by the implications of this grab bag of others' personal effects and did not like any of the scenarios it implied. I took a step back and almost jumped out of my skin when I heard a hiss and the striking of a glass wall and saw a row of terrariums that contained several large snakes. I knew she must have had one from before, but I didn't know she had this many. They seemed oddly perturbed and upset by my presence, and the one who made the sound had attacked the glass to try and reach me. I shuddered when I considered they might be venomous. I tried to catch my breath when my blood froze as I stood there hearing, with distinct certainty, a moving sound coming from the attached bathroom. It sounded like an enormous slithering sound, like that of a snake, but far too large. I crept closer to the bathroom and heard a sickening crunching sound like bone being snapped in half. My heart was hammering in my chest and I couldn't move, but I saw a large shadow looming near the other side of the bathroom door. I covered my mouth and tried to slowly back out of the room. Suddenly, the door handle began to turn, and I fell back into the dark corner of the room. The door didn't open just then. For whatever reason, the figure on the other side continued to slide around in the bathroom, and another savage crunch was heard. I let out a controlled, raspy gasp to not make too much noise, and I pressed my hands against the wall to steady myself. As I touched the wall, I felt something gross and sticky. I managed to sit upright and slowly step away from the wall, trying to be as quiet as I could. I gently reached back into my pocket to get my phone and turned to face the corner of the wall I had just been pressed up against. Once the light shone on the scene, I felt like I was going to be sick. The corner held an array of large bundles of meat, still slicked with gore and wrapped in a large bundle of butcher's twine. I did not like the shape of the thing at all. The proportions were very large, but not so large as to be bovine or deer. Some seemed to be disturbingly suggestive in length and general outline to that of the human anatomy. I didn't know if the light was playing tricks on me, but I could have sworn I saw the outline of an entire human-sized femur in a partially flensed chunk of meat. I turned away in disgust at the smell and general horror of the scene and quickly crept towards the door. The handle once again jostled on the bathroom door, and this time it did start to open. I flung myself forward onto the ground and crawled under the bed. I held my breath, but almost let out a gasp as I saw what appeared to be a partially eaten human head under the bed near where I was hiding. I held both hands over my mouth and closed my eyes as I heard the terrible dragging sound of the titanic serpentine body slithering over the floor. I almost screamed aloud when, after a pause, a scaled hand reached underneath the bed and groped for something near where I was. It reached for a moment and then grasped the half-eaten head and pulled it out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I simply waited in terrified suspense as I heard awful crunching and tearing sounds and the sucking guttural consumption of the morbid meal from a creature not fully used to chewing its food. I also saw under there, when I opened my eyes again, the discarded dishes from my dining set, caked in what looked alarmingly like dried blood. I lost track of the exact time I spent in that nightmare room, listening to the thing finish its morbid meal. Then, somehow, the slithering about the room stopped, and I heard the soft padding of human feet and a sudden pressure on the bed above me as of someone sitting down. Daring to set my eyes ahead and look out slightly, I saw two normal-looking women's feet, and I heard a soft, sing-song humming of a song as a figure bent down and put shoes on and walked forward, and from the sounds of the door had departed the room. I let out a loud exhale of exhausted fear, and I fought the dueling urges to either cower under here for a bit longer or rush out of this nightmare room in a blind, frenzied panic, regardless of how close its horrifying occupant might still be. I tried to calm myself down, and eventually, after what may have been 2 or 3 minutes, I pulled myself from under the bed and rushed out of the room. I whirled back to close the door to Lania's room, and as the door clicked and my hand was still on the door, I heard a voice call out, "Is there something you need in my room?" I froze in place, terrified of turning around for fear of what I might see. I managed to spin my petrified body around, and I saw Lania. No monster, just Lania. She was fully dressed, no blood was covering her body, and no snakes writhed about. I stood there staring dumbly before her, stammering for an answer. Her eyes narrowed at my reaction, and I realized I needed to say something. I looked at the batteries still sitting by her door. "I needed to change the batteries on your carbon monoxide detector." Almost on cue, the shrill beep was heard again to accentuate my point and give me what was at first a genuine answer to her question. She looked on incredulous, but seemed to soften as she winced when she heard the shrill beep again, seemingly noticing now that I had pointed it out. "All right, I can see how that might be annoying. I am sorry, please allow me." She brushed past me back into her room, and after a minute the beeping was gone. She came back out and smiled at me. "Oh, I almost forgot here." She handed me an envelope. It contained an assortment of bills, many of which were stained with a disturbing dark brown color. In total, it looked to be close to $4,000. For rent, and consider the rest extra for the batteries. She winked at me and brushed past me, and I stood there dumbfounded as I heard the front door open and close, and a car leaving shortly thereafter. I have no idea what just happened, or if what I experienced was real or a nightmare. I know now what I fear is likely the truth, but what did I really see? Whatever Lania is doing, or indeed, whatever she might truly be, I do not know. But I do know that besides the mess and the eccentricities, she pays her bills on time. The awful nightmare of a serpentine woman hybrid who preys on men is damnably suggestive of the story of the demonic Lamia. I considered her name too, Lania? No, just a coincidence, I'm sure, like that Ted who went missing. Maybe I will ask her about it later, but for now, I think I should deposit this money into my account and start a savings account. Perhaps I can afford to ask her to leave a little bit later. Yes, I think that would be the safer option. Demons can't be real, right? But homelessness sure is, and I mean, I am just being paranoid, right? It came from my wallpaper. I got a job in San Diego not too long after the pandemic settled. It was an exciting time, but I was also anxious about finding a place to live. I didn't have that much saved up, so I had to find somewhere a bit more lenient to newcomers. I signed up to all kinds of lists and tenant groups, but most leads were dead in the water. The only places within my price range had a no pets policy, and I couldn't bring myself to rehome my cat Marmalade. Poor thing was just a year old and a complete mama's girl. After weeks of searching, I stumbled upon a landlord with a vacant spot. He hadn't even got the time to list it. All I'd seen was a post about a cheap apartment. I messaged him spontaneously and asked about it. Turns out the previous tenant had passed away. It was on the 4th floor, not too far off Main Street, and surprisingly cheap. Cat-friendly too. He offered me a deal. If I paid for the cleanup crew, the place was mine. I couldn't say no. Once the place was cleaned up, I met up with my new landlord and got the keys handed to me. My new place was on the top floor of this beautiful old building, made somewhere back in the 50s. Cool stone-tiled floors, spacious ceiling, and plenty of sunlight coming in from the body-sized windows. There was a sort of French balcony with a little space to smoke or a mini garden. There was a large living room area, a tiny kitchenette, and a cramped little bedroom on the sunny side. It wasn't much, but I could see myself growing attached to it. You could tell it was old, though. There were all kinds of little quirks. A lock that you had to jiggle, pipes that rumbled a little whenever you took a shower, and you could immediately tell if one of your neighbors were smoking because of the shitty ventilation. It was far from perfect, but for that price at that location, I couldn't ask for a better deal. The one thing that dated it more than anything else, however, was the strange 70s wallpaper. This intricate floral pattern covered most of the living room, along with the western wall of the bedroom. A dark gray base color with lines of white. Roses, tulips, sunflowers, all in variations of silver and blue. It was beautiful in a sort of primitive Art Deco kind of way, but you could tell it was old. I promised myself to get it replaced if I were to live there long term. It didn't take long to move in. I didn't have much in the way of furniture, and I didn't really have the money to bring in something new. I figured I'd settle for what little I had for the time being, instead focusing on getting used to my new job. I was working as a full-time consultant for a telecom company, mostly focusing on process management and evaluation. Might not sound that interesting, but you get a lot of wiggle room to really switch things up for the better. Post-pandemic, we were on a routine of a single weekly meeting, and the rest could and would be done from our home office. It felt kind of dumb to force people to come in once a week just because, but if I wanted the job, that was the deal. Marmalade got settled in that place long before I did. She found a sunny spot next to one of the big windows. I set up a cozy basket for her to snuggle into. I, on the other hand, was having trouble sleeping those first few nights. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling. I'd lose myself in that view, sort of like when you're looking down into dark waters, you can't really see where it ends, it is just this perpetual nothing. And you can imagine it continuing forever. That first week went by in a flash. I had my first meeting and got my first assignment, process assessment, at one of the branch offices in Pittsburgh. Long distance, with an in-person evaluation at the end of a 2-month cycle. Nothing I couldn't handle, but said office had a sort of reputation for being unmanageable. It was the kind of assignment you throw at someone to see if they got the chops for it long term. That first day was mostly meet and greets, with a tiny afterwork at one of the chic downtown bars. It was mostly an excuse to crack a few cold ones on a Monday. My new colleagues were a few decibels louder than I was used to, so I ended up sitting mostly in the background, learning to appreciate a small label dark pumpkin ale. The next day, I was in full work mode. I set up my laptop with a view of my awful wallpaper to make it look a bit more office-like. Marmalade wasn't moving from her new favorite spot by the window, so there were no fluffy tails in the way of my webcam. I had a long talk with the branch manager, along with a few technicians, to just sort of dip my toe in the water. They were all courteous enough, but I could tell they'd been through the ringer a couple of times. This wasn't their first assessment, and it wouldn't be their last. By the end of the day, I was talking with one of the salesmen, a woman named Deirdre. At that point, I'd been in constant Zoom calls for over 4 hours, and my voice was giving out. Deirdre could tell I was exhausted, and we ended up just talking about other things instead. My apartment, my job, my cat. I had to bother Marmalade a bit just to show her off. Deirdre showed off her own feline companion, a 3-year-old ragdoll named Popeye. Ironically, that call ended up being my longest, but it went by the fastest. Deirdre was a gem. I spent most of my time setting up questionnaires and mapping out the overall structure. I was in daily calls, bouncing emails all the way down the supply chain, trying to get a clear picture of the main issues. It was the same old story that I'd heard 100 times before: management blaming the salesmen blaming the warehouse, and the warehouse blaming the technicians. There were little hitches all the way down the road, ranging from dated inventory systems to useless red tape. After the first few days, I started getting into a routine. Ping-ponging between meetings and Excel spreadsheets, Marmalade and I made that apartment into a proper home. Chinese takeout boxes started lining the kitchenette, and I had a few extra talks with Deirdre just to pass the slow hours. I started getting used to that place, even the awful wallpaper. I stopped hearing the rumbling pipes after a while, and the cigarette smoke from the neighbor slowly blended into the background smells. I stopped waking from cars passing on the streets below, and my first paycheck went into making the living room look like something that could actually be lived in. I remember one night when I was working overtime. I got a late email about submitting a progress report, so I had to stay up making a presentation. I found myself by the opinion that this was looking more and more like a management issue. Who the hell sends that kind of email at 4:50 p.m. on a Thursday, expecting it to be done before lunch the next day? Unbelievable. I was done by about 10 p.m. when I shambled away from my laptop. I picked up a can of cat food for Marmalade and walked over to her favorite window. Only she wasn't there. Her bed was still there, but Marmalade had moved to another window. Still sleeping soundly, but she'd found a new favorite spot. It felt strange, in a way, like the entire apartment had shifted a little. Looking up at the wallpaper, I could have sworn the patterns had moved. It looked identical, just a bit off. I could have sworn it was different, despite looking exactly same. It was a strange feeling. Everything felt familiar, but that one little twist made it feel like a new room. I was starting to doubt myself. When looking at Marmalade out of her basket, however, it was clear that something was different, in some way. The next few days, I started to notice this shift in new ways. The walls would look different at night. Where at one point I'd see a sunflower, I'd see a rose the next day. Then again, I wasn't ever really sure, and I chalked it up to me just not paying attention. Marmalade would move from spot to spot, never really sure what her favorite ever was. One night, she couldn't settle in at all, instead moving from one window to the next, meowing at me anxiously. That night, as I lay awake, I had my eyes firmly fixed on the wall. I could imagine the patterns moving on their own, the many flowers gently swaying to an invisible wind. It was just that kind of unreal surrealist thought you catch just before you fall asleep, but in that moment, I could have sworn it was real, living even. As I closed my eyes, I imagined the dark gray background color to be as deep as an ocean, a darkness stretching into a distant nothing. The next day, as I was making my morning coffee, I noticed something peculiar. I stepped on a dry blue petal. I couldn't explain where it came from. I had no flowers in my apartment, and the ventilation was so shit that it could barely rotate air. Flower petals were out of the question. Marmalade played with it for a while, and I convinced myself that it was just something I dragged in. Still, it reminded me of a flower petal from the blue roses on the wallpaper. It made me anxious, but I couldn't figure out why. What was I even worried about? I couldn't let that thought go for the rest of the day. That I was missing something obvious, or maybe that there really was something to my strange paranoia. So at the end of the day, when I talked to Deirdre, I brought it up. I explained that there was just something inherently creepy about living there, like an uncomfortable thought tickling your neck when you're not looking. Deirdre tried to reassure me, her chuckle coming through my headphones. "It takes time, love," she said. "You just got here, besides everything looks strange in the dark." "Yeah, I just can't shake the feeling, I explained. "Like there's something more to it." "Like what?" I didn't know what to answer. As I stepped into the living room, I noticed Marmalade rolling on the living room carpet, casually playing with another blue petal. Turning on the lights, I could see more of them. Over a dozen dry blue petals lining the edge of the wall. Finally, I could tell I wasn't going crazy. This wasn't a one-time deal, that was real. Marmalade didn't seem to mind, though. "I'm gonna have to get back to you," I told Deirdre. Something came up. As the call ended, I started scooping up the petals by hand. The moment my knees hit the floor, there was a power surge. It was all so quick. A flash of black, Marmalade hissed, looking straight past me, and I could hear a rustling noise, like a large animal moving through a bush. As quick as it had come, it went, leaving only a startled cat and my elevated pulse behind. The lights were slapped back on with a click, blinding me. Marmalade retreated to behind the couch while I picked up the rest of the petals. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the many patterns, petals in hand. I could imagine the gray sinking deeper and deeper, showing me something past the obvious. Like one of those images you have to look at cross-eyed to see the truth. I had the same sensation, like I was missing something obvious. I could imagine hearing things deep in an imagined forest. I could hear branches snapping. I could imagine the blue flowers swaying in the wind. And somewhere in all that depthless dark, something roamed, something looking for an exit. At some point, I snapped to attention. There was a loud electronic noise, an alarm. It was already morning. For some alien reason, I'd been stuck there for hours, just staring at the hypnotizing patterns. An entire night's rest gone. It wasn't until I stepped away that I realized just how exhausted I really was. My legs had locked on place, keeling me over straight to the stone-tiled living room floor. Marmalade rushed over, worried about this sudden development. I spent a few minutes just sitting there, calming myself down. The ringing from my cell phone was going strong, trying to give me enough time to shower before my first morning meeting. And yet, I just sat there, slowly petting my cat. My eyes bobbing in and out of sleep, my body deprived. Where'd I been all night? What I seen? I barely made it through that day, having a 45-minute nap over lunch. By the time I finished my last interview, I was a shell of my old self, barely conscious. I filled Marmalade's food and water bowl and crawled into bed with all my clothes still on. The moment my eyes closed, I could hear something in the distance. In the half-world between sleeping and waking, I heard breaking branches, owls taking flight, and something large approaching. And despite I knowing I was well and truly alone, my body screamed at me to wake, to have one more look, just in case. I did. I forced my eyes open. Something sharp scratched against the stone-tiled floor. Something retreating in haste. A trail of dry petals leading right up to the side of my bed. After a night of dreamless sleep, I woke up to choking on something. It took me almost a full minute to cough up a blue petal, several of which had been sprinkled throughout my bed. I could have sworn the wallpaper looked a bit lighter, as if several flowers were looking sparse. The whole wall looked a bit darker. That morning, I'd had enough. I called in sick and brought out my toolbox. I started scraping off the wallpaper, piece by piece, across the entire apartment. I made a day of it, listening to music as Marmalade looked at me curiously. Every illustrated petal and stem dropped to the floor, cut by cut, like trimming a paper garden. By the end of the day, my wall was laid bare, revealing nothing but black lead-painted concrete underneath. That night, after a long shower, I went to sleep with wallpaper remains still lining the edge of the room. Finally, I could focus. I could look past the hypnotizing patterns. It was done, gone, over. Except it was. As I went to sleep, my eyes drifted to the barren walls. A black, eternal night, now unhindered by what little paper-thin barrier had been erected. Just looking at it gave me that feeling in my stomach, like I was falling forward. Even closing my eyes felt brighter than staring into it, like it was more than a color, a place. At some point in the night, I heard this loud yowl. Looking up, I could see Marmalade sitting at the edge of my bed, staring straight at the wall, hissing and raising her hackles. Looking straight ahead, I saw something. There, deep in the dark of the bare wall, something moved. I swooped up Marmalade, who clung to my shoulder like a parrot. I threw on my pants, shirt, and got my bag. I'd had enough. I wasn't about to stick around to find out the depths of what was either my own insanity or something unnatural entirely. I didn't want to know. As I entered the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Every single wall had turned a midnight black. The windows had fogged up from the inside, blocking the moonlight from peeking in. I ran my hand along the wall, looking for the door. Something cold bumped against the palm of my hand. A finger. I recoiled, almost dropping Marmalade in surprise. I couldn't see my door. As I looked around, trying to find my bearings, I slowly came to the realization that nothing was quite as it should. The kitchenette was further away. The windows were further apart. The proportions of the room were off and seemingly shifting every time I blinked. It was as if everything in that darkness was untrue, malleable, subtly shifting as soon as I looked away, and so was I. Looking down at my hands, they'd seem different with every blink of my eye. They could be older, younger, scarred, masculine. It was impossible to tell. It was just diffuse enough for an anxious mind to fill in the blanks, but it felt like more than that. It wasn't just a fear of the dark, it was the dark changing me. Finally, I fumbled my way to the front door and pulled it open, and there was nothing. Just a solid black nothing. The apartment was getting darker. Even the windows were turning black. The kitchen sink was running, pushing forth dark, nondescript globs, all of which had this peculiar chemical smell. Ammonia. Marmalade was freaking out. She clung to me, digging her claws into my shirt, hissing at something in the dark. Whenever I turned around, the room would look different, swallowed further and further by the night. I could see vague silhouettes, hands reaching forward, some small, some impossibly large. I could imagine creatures the size of skyscrapers, towering forward. Impish little beasts nipping at my heels. I curled into a ball on the floor, clutching Marmalade close to my chest. Together we stared down anything and everything creeping closer. But I was losing. My light was dying. It was all going dark. Then I felt a rumble. I'd forgotten my phone was still in my pants. Bringing it out, I had a new message from Deirdre, the little screen lighting up a little bubble around me. I wasn't even on the floor anymore. I was sitting on a pile of dry grass and blue petals, and I could see the edge of a dead field stretching out around me in all directions. A wind cut through me like cold glass. And there really were things moving out there. Some big, some small, all vague and horrifying, waiting for me to look away long enough to take shape. Hey, hun. I heard you were feeling under the weather, so I just wanted to check in, get plenty of rest, we'll talk soon. I played it again and again. I filled my head with her voice and my eyes with what little light the phone struggled to provide. I could feel Marmalade's pulse beating against my neck. Something would brush against me, a light kick against my foot, footsteps rushing past. I saw nothing, but they were there, hidden in the dark. We'll talk soon, Deirdre's message repeated for the 10th time. We'll talk soon. We'll talk soon. I don't know how long I sat there, just waiting for the dark to pass, but nothing came of it. The battery was dying. As it reached the final few percentages of power, there was little left for me to do. The light was shrinking. I couldn't hear Deirdre's message anymore. Marmalade was yowling like crazy, hissing and striking at something unseen. As the screen died, I felt the chill of the world descend on me. In the silence, and I could feel something approaching, something careful and calculated. I couldn't see if, but I could feel it smiling at me, leering, eager. I was panicking. My skin felt like ice, and I couldn't feel my fingers. I held Marmalade close to me, and in a last-ditch effort, I flung my phone into the dark. Glass shattered. I'd thrown it through the window next to the little French balcony. A beam of morning light broke through. I turned around to an empty apartment, the layout exactly as I'd remembered it. The kitchenette still running. Torn down wallpaper lining the edges of the room. Marmalade's favorite bed still by the window, and the many Chinese takeout boxes still left unattended, just as it should be. Except every inch of the room was covered in dry, blue, flower petals. Needless to say, I didn't stick around for long. I moved out to the branch office where Deirdre worked and ended up staying there. We're still best of friends to this day. I haven't been able to talk to a lot of people about what happened that night. I get the sense that whatever lived in that dark space was just waiting for someone to tear down that barrier, that hedge of flowers and patterns. Something waiting to pull me into a dark place, never to return. Poor Marmalade hasn't been the same ever since. Her fur has turned a matted orange, and she's a lot clingier than before. She's okay though, she's a happy cat, but it'd be a lie to say she hasn't changed. The same can be said about me. It isn't a single obvious thing, but I feel like there are things about me that aren't that same. My eyes look darker. My fingers longer. My teeth sharper and whiter, just enough for me to notice and remember. In my new place, I sleep with the lights on. I try not to look too closely at the wallpaper, just in case. That's all for tonight. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe and share which one will linger in your thoughts. Until next time, rest well and don't turn your back on the dark.